picture the vast empty quarter of Saudi Arabia, your mind probably conjures an endless sea of sand, a landscape of beautiful, desolate silence, unchanged for millennia. We see it as a void on the map, a place defined by what it lacks: water, cities, people. We've been taught that civilization was born in the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia and the Nile, and that this vast peninsula was little more than a desolate corridor between them. We assume that for most of history, nothing of significance happened here. Except that is a staggering falsehood. It's not just wrong, it is the complete opposite of the truth. Because when you look not from the ground, but from the sky, that empty desert resolves into something impossible. It is covered, from one end to another, with hundreds of thousands of immense and mysterious stone structures. There are more ancient archaeological sites here than in almost any other place on Earth, and the oldest among them are more ancient than the first pyramids of Giza, more ancient than Stonehenge. This isn't just a curiosity, this is the story of a lost world that forces us to completely re-evaluate the dawn of human civilization. Today, we journey into a landscape that has been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years. We're going to explore a world of stone monuments so vast they can only be understood from space. We will investigate the colossal hunting traps known as desert kites, the baffling rectangular enclosures called muster tills, and the strange geometric shapes, gates, pendants, keyholes that defy all easy explanation. We will ask the most fundamental questions. Who were these forgotten people? How did they organize on such a mind-blowing scale without the machinery of a state? And what message did they leave for us, written in stone across the face of the Arabian desert? This is a story of a ghost civilization, a people without a name, who may represent one of the most important and least understood chapters in the entire human story. For generations, the only people who knew of these structures were the Bedouin, the nomads who crisscrossed these lands. To them, they were simply part of the landscape, the works of the old men. So ancient, their origins were lost to myth. From the ground, that's all they are. Most are just low, meandering walls of black basalt stone, rarely rising more than a few feet high. You could walk right past one, or even through it, and have no idea you were standing inside one of the largest structures ever built by Neolithic people. You cannot comprehend them at human scale. Your perspective is simply too limited. The first hints for the outside world came from the sky. In the 1920s, Royal Air Force pilots flying airmail routes across the deserts of Jordan and Arabia began noticing strange, sprawling patterns on the ground below. They sketched them in their logbooks, calling them kites because their long, funnel-like walls and enclosed heads reminded them of children's toys. But their purpose was anything but playful. For decades, these kites remained a fringe curiosity, a footnote in the archaeological record. The sheer scale of what they were seeing was too much to process. The real revolution came not from archaeologists with trowels, but from the silent gaze of satellites. When Google Earth went public, it handed the keys to the entire planet to anyone with a computer. And for the first time, researchers and even dedicated amateurs could systematically scan the vast sun-scorched plains of Saudi Arabia. What they found was not just a few kites. What they found was staggering, almost terrifying in its immensity. The desert was not empty. It was a carpet of stone structures, not dozens, not hundreds, but hundreds of thousands. A completely unknown world, an empire of stone, had been waiting silently for our eye in the sky to find it. Let's start with the kites, because they are perhaps the easiest to understand. Yet their implications are profound. Picture two long stone walls, sometimes stretching for miles, built in a giant V shape across the landscape. These walls, the strings of the kite are low, maybe just a foot or two high. They aren't barriers, they are psychological guides. They are designed to funnel entire herds of migrating animals, like gazelle, at full speed. The animals would be reluctant to leap over even a small, unknown obstacle while running in a panic. As the herd is driven deeper into the funnel, the walls get closer and closer, constricting their movement, creating a sense of inescapable pressure. At the very end of this colossal funnel, the kite's head is a circular enclosure, and often, hidden along the edges of that enclosure, are deep pits. The terrified animals, driven at a frantic pace, would pour into the enclosure and fall into these concealed traps where they could be easily dispatched by hunters waiting for them. This was not just hunting, this was industrial-scale animal processing. Think about what it takes to build one of these. First, you need a breathtakingly sophisticated understanding of animal psychology and behaviour. You have to know their migration routes with absolute precision. You have to know how they react to fear, to obstacles. You have to choose the location perfectly, using the natural topography to your advantage. This isn't the work of a single hunter. This is the work of a biologist, an engineer, and a strategist. Then there is the construction. The walls of a single kite can run for several miles. That is thousands of tons of stone, quarried, moved, and placed by human hands. Now multiply that. In one specific area of Saudi Arabia, the Harak Khaybar lava field, archaeologists have identified nearly 1,000 individual kites, packed so densely that they often overlap. The planning is almost unbelievable. These were not built randomly. They form intricate, interconnected chains. One kite seems to feed into the next, suggesting they were part of a coordinated system designed to capture animals on a regional scale over many generations. Who had the ability to organise labour on this level, thousands of years before the rise of cities or states? How did they communicate this complex blueprint across a vast population without writing? The kites tell us that the people living in ancient Arabia were not just scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. They were a highly organised, cooperative society with a deep understanding of their environment and the capacity for monumental, long-term engineering projects. They were thinking and building on a landscape scale, and the kites were just the beginning. As archaeologists looked closer at the satellite images, they saw something else, something much, much stranger. They are called mustatils. The name is from the Arabic word for rectangle, and that's what they are. Immense, long, rectangular structures made of low stone walls. Some are over 1,500 feet long, the length of 5 football fields, but they are often incredibly narrow, maybe only 60 feet wide. They consist of 2 long parallel walls capped at one end by a thick, solid platform of stone, which archaeologists call the head, and at the other by a very small, often blocked-off entrance. For decades, their purpose was a complete mystery. They weren't defensive structures. The walls are far too low. They weren't animal pens. The entrances are too small, and the layouts make no practical sense for managing livestock. They didn't seem to be dwellings. They were just there. Over 1,600 of them have been found so far, primarily in northwestern Saudi Arabia, dotting the landscape with their stark, geometric precision. They were clearly important. The people who built them invested an incredible amount of labour, more even than in the kites. But why? The breakthrough came with excavation. Researchers from the University of Western Australia were granted permission to dig at one of the mustatils near the oasis of Alula. As they carefully cleared the sand and debris from the head platform, they found something that changed everything. It was a chamber, and inside were the horns and upper skulls of wild cattle, known as aurochs, as well as those of gazelle and other wild-hoofed animals. They weren't just thrown in, they were carefully arranged, placed in a specific deposit, a clear offering. This was the key. The muster tills were not functional, they were ritualistic. They were vast open-air temples, designed for processions, ceremonies, and sacrifices. People would gather, perhaps entering through the narrow opening and walking the entire length of the structure as part of a communal ritual, culminating in an offering made at the head. This was a religious landscape, one of the oldest ever discovered on Earth. But here is where the story takes a mind-bending turn. When the organic material from the offerings was radiocarbon dated, the results were shocking. The muster tills were built around 7,500 years ago. Let that sink in. That is 2,500 years before the first stone was set at Stonehenge. It is nearly 3,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was constructed. At a time when we thought most of humanity was living in small scattered farming villages or as hunter-gatherers, the people of Arabia were building coordinated, monumental ritual architecture on a scale that is difficult to comprehend even today. They were engaging in a shared, organised religion, a cattle cult perhaps, that was powerful enough to unite people across hundreds of miles. To build these identical, massive structures. To understand why, we have to rewind the climate. 7,500 years ago, Saudi Arabia was not the desert we know today. It was in the final stages of a period known as the African Humid Period, or the Neolithic Wet Phase. Monsoon rains that today fall over Africa were shifted north. Arabia was a verdant savanna. Grassland stretched to the horizon, dotted with acacia trees. Seasonal lakes and rivers crisscrossed the landscape. It was teeming with life. Aurochs, gazelle, ostrich, even hippos and crocodiles in the larger river systems. This was the world that gave birth to the Mustatil builders. But this green paradise was beginning to die. The rains were becoming less reliable. The lakes were shrinking, the grasslands turning to scrub. The great herds of animals were disappearing. The construction of the Mustatils seems to coincide exactly with this period of dramatic climate change. Is it possible that this explosion of ritual building was a direct response to an impending ecological catastrophe? Were these great processions and offerings a desperate plea to the gods or to the spirits of the animals themselves to bring back the rain, to restore the green world that was slipping through their fingers? It paints a poignant, powerful picture, a society mobilizing on an unprecedented scale, not for war or for a king, but for a shared, existential purpose, using ritual as their last line of defense against a changing world. These people, this forgotten cattle cult of a green Arabia, left no writing, no pottery that we can definitively link to them, and very few signs of where they lived. All we have are their temples. They are a ghost civilization, and their existence forces us to ask a fundamental question. Does civilization require cities? Does it require a king, a state, a bureaucracy? The Mustatil builders seem to scream no. They suggest that complex, large-scale, socially stratified societies could emerge from a pastoralist or hunter-gatherer base, driven by the power of a unifying belief system. They built on a scale that rivaled the early states, but they seem to have done so without a capital city or a ruling elite in the way we understand it. They were a different kind of civilization entirely, and they didn't just build kites and mustatills. The more we look, the more we find. There are the so-called gates, which are perhaps the most mysterious of all. These are sprawling fields of short, thick stone lines, like a collection of eye shapes laid on the ground. Some have over 400 of these individual walls. They don't enclose anything. They don't seem to lead anywhere. Their function is a complete blank. Were they symbolic? Did they mark territory? We simply have no idea. Then there are the pendants. These are long single lines of stone cairns, sometimes hundreds of them, that trail away from circular burial tombs. They look like tails or strings attached to the tombs, stretching out across the desert floor. And there are triangles, keyhole tombs, and other geometric shapes, all built from the same dark basalt stone, all part of this same monumental stone building tradition. When you view these sites from above, you aren't looking at isolated structures. You are looking at a completely engineered landscape, a tapestry of ritual, burial, and subsistence woven together across thousands of square miles. It is a form of writing, a language of stone, whose grammar and vocabulary we have almost entirely lost. The sheer density is the hardest thing to grasp. In some areas, like the Harat Khaybar, you cannot look at a square mile of land without seeing dozens of these structures. The labour required is almost beyond calculation. One recent study estimated that to build just one of the larger muster tills would have required moving over 12,000 tons of basalt stone. This was not a casual undertaking. This was the central organising principle of their society for generations. Why go to all this effort? What belief could be so powerful as to compel thousands of people to dedicate their lives to quarrying and hauling black rock under a hot sun in the middle of a drying savanna? The answer might lie in the very act of building itself. In a world without written laws or a centralised police force, how do you forge a common identity? How do you create social cohesion among disparate groups of people spread out over a vast territory? You do it through shared projects, you do it through communal ritual. The act of coming together to build a mustatil or a kite would have been a powerful social glue. It reaffirmed your bonds with your neighbours. It connected you to your ancestors who built the one next to it. It initiated the young into the traditions of the tribe. The building was the purpose. The monuments were the physical manifestation of their society, the anchor of their culture in a changing world. But who were they exactly? Where did they come from? Genetically, ancient DNA from the region suggests these people were descended from the same hunter-gatherers who had lived in Arabia for tens of thousands of years, a unique, indigenous population. They were not migrants from the Levant or Africa bringing these ideas with them. This was a homegrown cultural explosion. It was a local response to local conditions. And as the desert advanced, as the green Arabia finally gave way to the sand, these people were forced to adapt. It's likely they moved towards the coastlines and the high mountain oases where water was more plentiful. Their way of life, so perfectly attuned to the savannah, was broken, and with it, their monumental building tradition seems to have faded. The kites fell into disuse, the muster tills were slowly covered by the sand. An entire chapter of human history, a vibrant, complex world, was quite literally erased by climate change. And for 7,000 years, it was forgotten. It became a ghost story, a myth of the old men, until our eyes in the sky gave us the power to see the ghosts. The implications of this discovery are profound. It fundamentally challenges the traditional narrative of civilization, the one that points to a single cradle in Mesopotamia. The idea that all complex societies arose from the surplus of agriculture, leading to cities, writing, and kings, is shown to be far too simplistic. Arabia presents us with an alternative path. It shows us that monumental architecture, large-scale social cooperation, and complex abstract ritual belief could arise in a non-urban, non-agrarian context. It decentralizes our story. There wasn't one cradle of civilization. There were many, and many of them failed or were forgotten. What we are seeing in Saudi Arabia is a kind of shadow history. The ghosts of these structures are forcing us to reconsider the very nature of the Neolithic period. It was not a simple, linear progression from hunting to farming to cities. It was a messy, experimental, and dynamic era, filled with many different attempts at building a complex society. The Arabian experiment was one of the earliest and, in its own way, one of the most successful. For a time, they were arguably the most sophisticated monumental builders on the entire planet. And we are only at the beginning of this story. The vast majority of these sites have never been visited by an archaeologist on the ground, let alone excavated. Saudi Arabia, for so long closed off to most foreign archaeological research, is now opening up. What we have learned in the last 10 to 15 years, primarily from satellite imagery, has already rewritten textbooks. What will we learn in the next 50 years as more and more of these sites are properly studied? What other secrets are they hiding? There may be remains of settlements, of course. Perhaps their dwellings were made of organic materials, wood, hides, brush, that have long since vanished, leaving only their stone temples behind. This would create the illusion of a people who only existed for ritual, a society of priests with no congregation. But that can't be the full picture. Somewhere out there, the clues to their daily lives, their social structure, their art are waiting to be uncovered. Each new excavation offers a tiny glimpse into their world. Some muster tills contain multiple layers of offerings, suggesting they were used and revisited over centuries, becoming sacred places imbued with ancestral power. The very stone they used tells a story. In the Harat Khaibar, it is a volcanic basalt, dark and heavy. This gives the structures a stark, imposing presence against the lighter desert floor. The choice was practical. It was the stone that was available, but it also lent a specific character to their creations. These are not elegant, carved monuments like those of Egypt or Greece. They are rugged, raw, and powerful. They speak of a connection to the earth itself, to the violent, volcanic origins of the land they inhabited. They are structures of the landscape, not just structures on the landscape. We also have to wonder about the connections between the different types of structures. Were the kite builders and the mustatil builders the same people? The timelines seem to overlap. It's plausible that a family group might have spent part of the year maintaining their section of a hunting kite, and another part of the year participating in the construction and rituals at a nearby mustatil. Their economic and spiritual lives would have been completely intertwined. The kites provided the physical sustenance, the food that fed the community. The mustatils provided the spiritual sustenance, the belief system that held that community together. You cannot separate them. It was a single, coherent system for living in the world. Let's re-examine the scale, because it is the single most important and most difficult aspect to truly feel. Imagine you are one of these ancient people. Your entire world is defined by what you can walk to. News travels at the speed of a human runner. Yet you are part of a project that involves building a structure identical in form and function to one being built by people 50 miles away, people you may never have even met. How is that possible? There must have been a powerful, unifying oral tradition, a shared mythology, a common set of ritual instructions passed down with incredible fidelity from generation to generation. This suggests a level of cultural and social integration across a vast region that archaeologists had previously thought was impossible for a pre-state society. It implies networks of communication, of pilgrimage, of kinship. The mustatils were not just isolated temples. They were nodes in a network, a sacred grid laid across the landscape that connected everyone who was a part of this belief system. It was a kind of biological internet, connecting disparate groups into a single cultural organism. And it was all done without a single written word. The sheer ambition is what is so humbling. These people looked at a vast open landscape and did not just see a place to hunt. They saw a canvas. They saw a place to impose order, to express their relationship with the cosmos, to build a world that reflected their beliefs. They were terraformers. Their work was a statement of their presence, their power, and their faith. It was a declaration, written in stone, that this land was theirs, and that they understood its secrets. Think about the silence. For 7,000 years, these structures sat. The winds blew, sand piled up against their walls, and the memory of their creators vanished from the earth. Civilizations rose and fell around them. The Egyptians built their pyramids. The Romans built their empire. And all the while, the largest concentration of Neolithic monumental architecture on the planet lay dormant and unknown. It is a profound lesson in the fragility of memory and the resilience of stone. What we build can long outlast the reasons why we built it, and so we are left with a ghost civilization that is only now beginning to take shape in our understanding. We don't have a name for them, but we can see their works. We don't know the names of their gods, but we can see the altars where they left their offerings. We don't know the details of their rituals, but we can walk the length of their ceremonial avenues. We are like detectives who have arrived at the scene of a crime thousands of years too late, piecing together the story from the faintest of clues. This discovery does more than just add a new chapter to our history books. It changes the nature of the book itself. It forces us to be more humble, to recognize that the story of humanity is far richer, more complex, and more mysterious than we ever imagined. It reminds us that entire civilizations, brilliant and powerful in their own right, can flourish, create wonders, and then vanish so completely that they are forgotten for millennia. It proves that what we think of as empty spaces are often just archives we haven't yet learned how to read. The deserts and the jungles and the deep oceans of our world are full of these forgotten stories. The people of the Green Arabia faced a world-changing crisis. Their response was to come together, to build, to engage in a shared act of faith on a monumental scale. It was a brave, creative, and ultimately tragic attempt to hold back the inevitable. Their world disappeared beneath the sand, but their message, written in stone, survived. It's a message about the power of belief to shape the physical world, about the deep human need to create meaning and order in the face of chaos. And it's a reminder that we too live on a changing planet, and that the choices we make, the things we build, will tell our story long after we and our reasons are gone. What we are seeing in the deserts of Saudi Arabia is not just the story of a lost civilization, it's a mirror, and it asks us a very simple question: what will we leave behind? But before we can answer what we will leave behind, we must first understand the full vocabulary of what they left for us. The kites and mustatils are just the first two words in a much longer and far stranger sentence written across the desert. Because as our eyes adjust to this new way of seeing the landscape, other shapes begin to emerge from the noise, shapes that are in many ways even more enigmatic. Let's return to those structures known as gates. It's a simple, evocative name for something that utterly defies simple explanation. Picture not a single structure, but a field of them. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of short parallel lines of heaped stone, each connected by a single, longer wall at each end, like a field of capital ones or stretched out number signs scattered on the ground. They are not enclosures, they are not funnels, they are arrays of low, thick walls, often built on the slopes of volcanic cones, a pattern laid over the land with no obvious purpose. Some of these gates are enormous, sprawling over hundreds of yards. The labour involved is, once again, immense. But for what? One theory attempts to link them to the kites. What if the gates were the first step in the hunt? Imagine a herd of gazelle grazing on a mountainside. A group of hunters positioned above them begins to make noise, driving the animals downhill. The animals flee, not into an open plain, but into one of these bizarre fields of low walls. The effect would be pure chaos and disorientation. The animals would be forced to navigate a confusing maze of obstacles, breaking up the cohesion of the herd, separating the young from the old, the strong from the weak. Their flight would be slowed, their path made unpredictable. And where would this chaotic flight lead them? Perhaps directly into the waiting mouth of a massive desert kite. In this scenario, the gates are not structures in themselves, but are instead a piece of a much larger machine, a cognitive weapon designed to exploit the psychology of a panicked herd. It's a compelling idea. It speaks to the same level of breathtaking sophistication we see in the kites. But there's a problem. Many gates are found nowhere near a kite. They exist in complete isolation. Vast, silent fields of stone lines on a remote hillside. They lead nowhere. They protect nothing. They enclose nothing. So what are they? Were they territorial markers, a symbolic line in the sand, a declaration of ownership by a particular clan or tribe? Perhaps. Or were they something more abstract? Could they represent a calendar, with each bar marking a specific period of time? Could they be a map of the stars, a diagram of a myth, a prayer rendered in heavy stone? The truth is, we are completely in the dark. The gates remain one of the most profound mysteries of this landscape. They are a form of communication we can see perfectly, but cannot begin to comprehend. They are like finding a book written in a language that has no alphabet, no grammar, no Rosetta Stone to help us translate. And as we pan out, still looking from our God's eye view, we see that the world of these people was not just about the hunt and the ritual. It was also profoundly shaped by death. Their relationship with their ancestors was not something hidden away. It was monumentalized, written into the very fabric of the land in the form of thousands upon thousands of funerary structures. We mentioned the pendants before, but now let's look closer. Picture a central tomb, a large circular cairn of stone built over a burial chamber. From this central ring, a single line of smaller stone piles, a tail, stretches away across the landscape. Sometimes this tail is just a few dozen yards long. Sometimes it is a staggering half a mile, a dotted line of stone connecting the dead to the horizon. And these are not rare. There are thousands of them. What does this mean? Why invest this incredible effort, not just in the tomb itself, but in this long, seemingly decorative appendage? The answer tells us something deep about how they viewed the world. The pendant is a connector. It visually links the deceased to the broader landscape. It announces their presence and their lineage to all who pass by. It's a statement of belonging. This person was not just an individual, they were part of this place, and their spirit is now woven into it. But it gets more complex. In many cases, these pendants don't just trail off into nothing, they lead to other tombs. You find funerary avenues, vast chains of interconnected graves, where the tale of one ancestor's tomb leads directly to the tomb of another and another and another. What you're looking at is a family tree, a genealogy rendered in stones on a scale of miles. It is a physical manifestation of their ancestry, a map of their social and genetic history. You could literally walk your bloodline back through generations, from grave to grave, across the desert. This is a society obsessed with heritage, with the connections between the living and the dead. The ancestors were not gone. They were still present, their tombs forming a network of power and memory that structured the world of the living. Travel routes may have been guided by these avenues. Territorial claims were likely based on them. Your identity was inseparable from this visible, stone-built history of your people, and the tombs themselves are not all the same. There are the simple ring cairns. There are massive tower tombs, cylindrical structures that would have stood out for miles like lighthouses in the desert. And then there are the keyholes and the triangles. The keyhole tombs have a circular head, the tomb itself, with two parallel walls forming a long, narrow court or entranceway, creating a shape exactly like an old-fashioned keyhole. The triangles are solid, triangular platforms of stone, often with a pillar or cairn at one of the corners. The sheer variety is baffling. Did different shapes belong to different tribes, different time periods, different social classes? Were the people buried in the elaborate tower tombs, and keyholes more important than those in the simple ring cairns? It seems almost certain. This funerary landscape is not egalitarian. It hints at a stratified society with chiefs, priests, or heroes who were afforded a level of monumental remembrance far beyond that of ordinary people. We may not have found their palaces, but in these sprawling cemeteries, we are looking at the ghostly fingerprints of their social hierarchy. So you have a landscape of industrial hunting traps, of vast open-air temples, and of genealogical maps made of tombs. These three systems, subsistence, religion, and ancestry, are all layered on top of each other, often in the same place. You find kites running right next to funerary avenues. You find muster tills built in sight of fields of tombs. It was a single, integrated world. But was this world purely terrestrial? Was it only concerned with the animals, the land, and the ancestors? Or were they also looking up? This is where the story takes another turn, one that connects this lost Arabian world to the great ancient mysteries across the globe. Researchers began to wonder if the precise geometric layouts of the mustatils held another secret. They are all rectangles, and they all have a head and an entrance. But is their orientation on the ground random, or does it mean something? Using sophisticated satellite mapping and astronomical software, archaeologists were able to analyse the exact alignment of hundreds of these structures. What they found is a revelation. A statistically significant number of the mustatils they studied are aligned with the sunrise during the solar standstill, what we call the solstices. Specifically, they seem to point towards the sunrise during the longest days of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. Let that sink in. These people, 7,500 years ago, were not just building temples to their gods. They were orienting those temples to the movements of the sun. This is a mind-blowing leap in complexity. It implies they had a sophisticated knowledge of astronomy. They had a calendar. They had a way of marking the changing of the seasons, not just by observing nature around them, but by using monumental architecture to lock in the most important days of the year. The rituals performed in the mustatils were likely tied to these solar events. A procession down the long axis of the mustatil might have culminated at sunrise on the solstice, when the first rays of light would have struck the offering platform, the head, in a moment of profound religious significance. Suddenly the mustatls are not just places of offering. They are clocks, they are calendars, they are astronomical observatories, they are machines for synchronizing human society with the great, unchanging cycles of the cosmos. This connects the mustatil builders to the traditions of Stonehenge in England, of Newgrange in Ireland, of Karnak in Egypt. It is a fundamental human impulse to find our place in the universe by mapping its rhythms onto our most sacred spaces. And the people of Arabia were doing it thousands of years before many of these more famous examples. The picture of their society is becoming richer, deeper. They understood animal psychology, landscape engineering, geology, and astronomy. They had a complex religion, a deep reverence for their ancestors, and a hierarchical social structure. And they had all of this without a single city, without a king in a palace, and without a written word. It is a breathtaking challenge to everything we thought we knew about the Neolithic world. But there is one more piece of this puzzle, another layer of information that we must add. For all the mystery of their stone structures, these people did leave us more intimate messages. They left us pictures. Scattered across the Arabian Peninsula are hundreds of thousands of petroglyphs, images carved into the dark patina of rock faces. And in places like Jubba and Shuwaimis, now UNESCO World Heritage Sites, this art provides a stunning visual companion to the monumental structures. Here, you see the world through their eyes. There are countless scenes of hunting, men with bows and arrows accompanied by domesticated dogs, some of the earliest depictions of the partnership between humans and dogs anywhere in the world, are shown stalking ibex, oryx, and wild cattle. You see the animals they revered, carved with a lifelike dynamism. But most importantly, you see detailed depictions of cattle. Not just any cattle, but herds of longhorned bovines, identical to the aurochs, whose horns were found as offerings in the mustatils. The rock art is the missing link. It confirms the central importance of the cattle cult that the mustatils hinted at. Here are the animals, depicted in loving detail. Here are the people who revered them. Some carvings show human figures, with arms raised, in what appear to be poses of adoration or ritual. We may be looking at depictions of the very ceremonies that took place inside the great rectangular temples. The art also gives us a timeline. By studying the different styles of carving and the layers of varnish that have built up over them, researchers can date the art. The oldest layers correspond perfectly to the Green Arabia period, the time of the mustatil builders. You can literally see the climate change in the rock art. In the oldest panels, you see rich savanna wildlife. In later panels, the savanna animals disappear and they are replaced by camels. The art is a direct record of the ecological catastrophe they endured. It is their history book, written not on paper, but on the living rock of the landscape. What's more, the distribution of this art is not random. It is often found along what would have been ancient pathways, near water sources, or overlooking important valleys. And critically, it is often found in and around the great stone monuments. It is part of the same sacred landscape. A person walking the funerary avenue of their ancestors might have passed by a rock face carved with the story of the great hunt that founded their clan. A group gathering for a solstice ritual at a mustatil might have first stopped at a nearby cliff face to view the sacred images of the aurochs. The art and the architecture are not separate. They are two sides of the same coin. The monuments are the hardware, the immense permanent structures that defined their world. The art is the software, the mythology, the stories, the beliefs that gave those structures meaning. Without the art, we have silent, empty stages. Without the architecture, we have stories with no context. Together, they give us an unprecedented glimpse into the mind of this lost civilization, and they reveal a world that was far from empty or silent. It was a landscape alive with meaning, pulsing with ritual, and saturated with the presence of animals, spirits, and ancestors. Every rock face, every valley, every volcanic cone was part of a story. Their world was an entirely enchanted one. And this might be the most important clue of all as to why they built these things. In our modern, secular world, we tend to look for practical, functional explanations for everything. The kites were for food, the tombs were for burial, but this is likely the wrong way to think. For these people, the practical and the spiritual were probably not separate categories. The hunt for gazelle was a practical act of survival, yes, but it was also a sacred ritual, steeped in beliefs about the spirit of the animal and the permission needed to take its life. The building of a tomb was a practical way to dispose of a body, but it was also a cosmic act of ensuring the continuity of the lineage and placating the spirits of the dead. The mustatills, the gates, the pendants, they were tools. They were a kind of technology, but not a technology for shaping the physical world in the way we think of it. They were a technology for shaping the cognitive and spiritual world. They were designed to create and reinforce a shared understanding of reality, a common belief system that could bind thousands of people together. They were instruments for focusing the mind, for directing spiritual energy, for making the abstract order of the cosmos visible and tangible on the earth. Think again of the labour, 12,000 tons of black basalt for a single muster till. Why? Because the effort was the point. The act of quarrying the stone, of hauling it, of placing it, was the ritual. It was a massive communal sacrifice of time and energy. And in a society without money, time and energy are the most valuable currency you have. By investing so much of their collective wealth into these structures, they were making them powerful. They were literally charging them with human energy, making them sacred places that would anchor their culture for centuries. This also helps explain the density. The fact that there are so many of these structures, often overlapping, suggests that they were built continuously over a very long period. It wasn't a single generation of master builders who created this landscape. It was a tradition passed down over 1,000 years or more. Each new generation added its own layer of meaning, its own structures. A new kite built to intercept a shifting migration route. A new muster till built to petition the gods during a particularly bad drought. A new tomb added to the end of a funerary avenue, extending the family tree one link further. The landscape is therefore not a single, static creation. It is a living document, a palimpsest of stone, with layers upon layers of history, belief and memory. Archaeologists today are faced with the immense challenge of trying to tease apart these layers, to understand which structures came first, and how their functions might have changed over time. A structure built as a temple in one era might have been repurposed as a territorial marker in another. A tomb built for a great chief might have become a place of pilgrimage for his descendants centuries later. And as we zoom in even closer, from the satellite to the archaeologist's trowel, we find even more subtle clues. Excavations have revealed that the builders were master stonemasons. The walls of the mustatils and kites are not just crude piles of rock. They're carefully constructed, with larger stones forming a stable foundation, and smaller stones used to fill the gaps. At the head of some mustatils, the platform stone is not just a rough slab, but is sometimes a single, massive, upright stone, a monolith known as a betel. This betel may have been seen as a physical embodiment of a deity or spirit, the focal point for the entire ritual. Inside the burial chambers of the tombs, we find not just bones, but grave goods, polished stone tools, beads made from seashell, traded from the coast hundreds of miles away, and finely crafted flint arrowheads. These are not the possessions of a simple, impoverished people. They are the signs of a society with skilled artisans, with long-distance trade networks, and with a belief in an afterlife that required the deceased to be equipped for a journey. All of this evidence, from the macro scale of the satellite image to the micro scale of a single seashell bead, is converging to tell the same story. The story of a civilization that was as complex, as innovative, and as powerful as any of its more famous contemporaries in Egypt or Mesopotamia. It was simply a civilization of a different kind. It was a civilization without cities, built on a foundation of pastoralism, hunting, and a profound spiritual connection to a green world that was dying. And the fact that it was forgotten is perhaps its most important lesson for us. History is not a simple story of progress. It is a story of experimentation, of brilliant successes and catastrophic failures. The ghost civilization of Arabia represents one of the great, forgotten experiments in human history. They created a unique and sustainable way of life that lasted for thousands of years. They engineered their landscape on a scale that we are only now beginning to appreciate. But they were ultimately powerless against a force they could not control: the slow, inexorable shift in the planet's climate. When the rain stopped for good, their entire world collapsed. The savannah turned to sand, the great herds vanished, and the basis of their economy and their religion was destroyed. The survivors were forced to adapt to become the true desert nomads of later history, and the memory of the great builders of the Green Arabia faded into myth, their works becoming nothing more than the enigmatic stone piles that the Bedouin called the works of the old men. It is a humbling reminder that even the most impressive civilizations are fragile. They are ecosystems, and like any ecosystem, they can be pushed past a tipping point from which there is no return. The rediscovery of this world in the 21st century is therefore not just an archaeological curiosity, it is a story for our time. It is a detailed case study of a society confronting existential environmental change. Their response was to turn to ritual, to community, and to monumental construction. They came together and built on a staggering scale, perhaps in a desperate attempt to restore the balance of their world. As we ourselves face a future of unprecedented environmental challenges, the story of the Mustatil builders echoes across 7 millennia with a chilling relevance. Their silent stone structures are not just a record of the past, they are a warning for the future, and to truly understand that warning, we have to step inside their world and see the landscape not as a passive backdrop, but as an active and often terrifying participant in their story. Let's return to the Harat Khaybar, that immense volcanic field where the structures are packed so densely. This was not just a quarry for their building materials, this was their home. Imagine living in a world sculpted by fresh lava flows, a jagged, black and alien terrain. A world of dormant volcanic cones, some of which may have still been steaming, their peaks seen as gateways to an underworld. This was a place of immense power, both creative and destructive. The very ground beneath their feet was a reminder of the violent forces that shaped the world. How could this not have profoundly influenced their cosmology? Their religion was likely not just a cattle cult, it was a chthonic faith, born of the earth, fire, and stone. The dark basalt they used wasn't just a convenient material, it was the very essence of their powerful and volatile world. When they built their temples and tombs from it, they were building with the solidified fire and blood of the earth itself, and this volcanic world offered more than just stone. It offered shelter. Dotted throughout these lava fields are countless lava tubes, vast subterranean caverns formed by flowing magma. Recent explorations of these tubes have uncovered a treasure trove of archaeological material. Hearths, stone tools, animal bones, and even human remains, dating back thousands of years. These were not just temporary shelters from the sun or the wind. They were homes, they were workshops, and some deep within the earth were likely sacred spaces, natural underground temples. Picture the scene. A community performs a public, sun-drenched ritual at a solstice-aligned muster till on the surface. But perhaps they also had another kind of ritual, one performed deep in the silent, absolute darkness of a lava tube, a ceremony connected to the underworld whose power they felt all around them. Their spiritual life had a dual nature, one of the sky and the sun, mapped out in their surface architecture, and one of the earth and the deep primordial darkness, enacted in these natural caverns. We have been so focused on what they built on the land that we are only just beginning to realize they also inhabited a world beneath it. This dual world of light and dark, surface and underworld, also hints at a more complex social reality. The script so far has emphasized the incredible cooperation needed to build on this scale. And that's true. But human societies are never that simple. Where there is cooperation, there is also competition. And these monuments are, without a doubt, a statement of power. Imagine you're the leader of a small clan. Your neighbours a day's walk to the east have just completed a new section of a hunting kite, one that will allow them to capture more gazelle than ever before. Or perhaps they have built a new, massive tomb for their recently deceased elder, its pendant tail stretching further than any in the region. What is your response? You gather your own people. You make your own statement. You build a bigger muster till. You create a longer funerary avenue. What we may be looking at is not just a shared religious project, but a form of competitive display, a monumental arms race played out over centuries. Building these structures wasn't just an act of faith, it was a political and economic act. It demonstrated the strength of your group, the number of able-bodied workers you could command, the richness of your resources, and the potency of your connection to the divine and the ancestral. The landscape became a giant billboard, an arena for intertribal rivalry and prestige. This social pressure could have been the engine that drove the sheer proliferation of these sites, each one a testament to a community's pride and power, a defiant cry of existence carved into the earth. And these rivalries and alliances were not happening in a vacuum. While the ghost civilization of Arabia was carving out its unique identity, it was not entirely alone. The seashell beads found in their tombs tell a powerful story of connection. These shells travelled hundreds of miles from the Red Sea or the Arabian Gulf, passed from hand to hand, group to group, in a vast informal network of exchange. Arabia was not an island, it was a crossroads. Think about what else might have travelled along these trade routes. Obsidian, a black volcanic glass that produces the sharpest known cutting edge, was a highly prized material for stone tools. There are known obsidian sources in the highlands of Western Arabia. Tools made from this specific obsidian have been found far into the Levant and Mesopotamia. The people who controlled these sources, the people of the muster tills and kites, were sitting on a resource of immense strategic value. They were players in the great game of Neolithic trade. And if goods were flowing, so were ideas. Just to the north, in what is now Jordan and Syria, settled agricultural villages were beginning to flourish. To the northwest in Turkey, the memory of Göbekli Tepe and its sophisticated ritual constructions was only a few thousand years old. It's inconceivable that there was no contact, no exchange of knowledge. The Arabian phenomenon was not a weird, isolated fluke. It was a unique and powerful expression of a much broader wave of human innovation that was sweeping across the Near East during the Neolithic. They were not simply reacting to their own drying climate, they were participating in and contributing to a regional explosion of new ideas about society, technology, and the cosmos. This places an even greater importance on the sheer intellectual achievement these structures represent. We need to pause and truly consider the mind of a mustatil builder. You have no writing, you have no mathematics on paper, you have no surveying equipment, no laser levels, no blueprints. Yet you are tasked with creating a perfect massive rectangle with parallel sides hundreds of yards long, oriented precisely to a specific point on the horizon. How do you even begin? You must have a sophisticated system of measurement, perhaps based on the human body, the cubit, the pace that is standardized across your entire culture. You must have a deep practical understanding of geometry, of right angles and parallel lines, knowledge passed down, not through textbooks, but through oral tradition and apprenticeship. You must have a way of marking and citing long distances, perhaps using a series of poles or cairns to keep your walls perfectly straight over uneven terrain. This is a form of applied science, and it requires a kind of thinking, a cognitive leap that we often take for granted. It requires the ability to project a purely abstract idea, a geometric form, an astronomical alignment onto the messy, imperfect real world, and to mobilize a community to execute that idea with stunning precision. This is evidence of a new kind of human consciousness, one that is capable of imposing its own abstract order upon nature on a truly monumental scale. They were not just shaping stone, they were shaping space itself according to a mental template. This ability to conceptualize and execute these grand designs seems to be a shared trait across the entire region. But as we look closer, using the high-resolution satellite imagery now available, we can start to see subtle but crucial differences. The monumental language they all spoke had distinct local dialects. The keyhole tombs, for example, are found in dense clusters around the Alula and Khaybar oases, but are much rarer elsewhere. The mysterious gate structures are heavily concentrated in the volcanic fields. The Harats, suggesting they are a specific adaptation or tradition associated with that unique landscape. Even the mustatils themselves show regional variations in their construction. Some have a single simple chamber in their head platform. Others have multiple, more complex cells. Some entrances are simple gaps in the wall. Others are flanked by more elaborate, almost pylon-like structures. This is not the work of a single, centralized authority dictating a uniform design from on high. This is the signature of a mosaic of different cultural groups, different tribes, or perhaps different cultic traditions. They were all part of the same shared cultural world, the world of the cattle cult, the kite hunt, and the ancestral tomb, but they expressed their membership in that world in their own unique ways. We are not looking at a single, homogeneous ghost civilization. We are looking at a complex confederation of peoples united by a common belief system, but fiercely proud of their own local identities. The desert was not one kingdom, but a patchwork of territories, each with its own history, its own traditions, and its own unique stylistic fingerprint left in stone. And their lives were not just an endless cycle of hunting, ritual, and building. Beneath this spectacular, monumental record lies the quieter story of their daily existence. To build these things, you need a healthy, well-fed population. The industrial-scale kite hunting provided a huge surplus of protein, but human beings cannot live on meat alone. The green Arabia was also a world of edible plants. The seasonal lakes and rivers would have been surrounded by reeds, tubers, and wild grasses. Is it possible they were harvesting wild cereals, a step just short of actual agriculture? Archaeological analysis of ancient pollen and residue on stone tools will eventually give us the answer. But for now, we can infer that they must have had a deep botanical knowledge, a map of the plant world that was just as sophisticated as their understanding of animal behaviour. This knowledge would have been crucial, especially as the climate grew drier and the great herds became less reliable. The ability to find and process edible plants would have been the buffer that stood between them and starvation. And then there is the most fundamental resource of all: water. In a drying world, everything revolves around water. The location of the great monumental clusters is not an accident. They are almost always situated near what would have been ancient springs, oases, or the catchment areas of seasonal rivers. The sacred places were the surviving places. The gods lived where the water was. Control of a major well or spring would have translated directly into immense social and political power. Is it possible that some of the structures we don't understand are related to water management? Could some of the low walls that meander across the landscape be designed not to guide animals, but to channel seasonal rainwater, to trap fertile silt, creating small temporary gardens? This is speculative, but it is a critical avenue for future research. If we find evidence that these people were not just hunting and gathering, but were actively manipulating their environment to manage scarce water resources, it will add yet another layer of staggering sophistication to their society. It would mean they were not just passive victims of climate change, but were actively and ingeniously fighting back. Let's return to those structures known as gates. It's a simple, evocative name for something that utterly defies simple explanation. Picture not a single structure, but a field of them. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of short parallel lines of heaped stone, each connected by a single, longer wall at each end, like a field of capital heads or stretched out number signs scattered on the ground. They are not enclosures, they are not funnels, they are arrays of low, thick walls, often built on the slopes of volcanic cones, a pattern laid over the land with no obvious purpose. Some of these gates are enormous, sprawling over hundreds of yards. The labour involved is, once again, immense. But for what? One theory attempts to link them to the kites. What if the gates were the first step in the hunt? Imagine a herd of gazelle grazing on a mountainside. A group of hunters positioned above them begins to make noise, driving the animals downhill. The animals flee, not into an open plain, but into one of these bizarre fields of low walls. The effect would be pure chaos and disorientation. The animals would be forced to navigate a confusing maze of obstacles, breaking up the cohesion of the herd, separating the young from the old, the strong from the weak. Their flight would be slowed, their path made unpredictable. And where would this chaotic flight lead them? Perhaps directly into the waiting mouth of a massive desert kite. In this scenario, the gates are not structures in themselves, but are instead a piece of a much larger machine, a cognitive weapon designed to exploit the psychology of a panicked herd. It's a compelling idea. It speaks to the same level of breathtaking sophistication we see in the kites. But there's a problem. Many gates are found nowhere near a kite. They exist in complete isolation, vast, silent fields of stone lines on a remote hillside. They lead nowhere. They protect nothing. They enclose nothing. So what are they? Were they territorial markers, a symbolic line in the sand, a declaration of ownership by a particular clan or tribe? Perhaps. Or were they something more abstract? Could they represent a calendar, with each bar marking a specific period of time? Could they be a map of the stars, a diagram of a myth, a prayer rendered in heavy stone? The truth is, we are completely in the dark. The gates remain one of the most profound mysteries of this landscape. They're a form of communication we can see perfectly, but cannot begin to comprehend. They are like finding a book written in a language that has no alphabet, no grammar, no Rosetta Stone to help us translate. And as we pan out, still looking from our God's eye view, we see that the world of these people was not just about the hunt and the ritual. It was also profoundly shaped by death. Their relationship with their ancestors was not something hidden away. It was monumentalized, written into the very fabric of the land in the form of thousands upon thousands of funerary structures. We mentioned the pendants before, but now let's look closer. Picture a central tomb, a large circular cairn of stone built over a burial chamber. From this central ring, a single line of smaller stone piles, a tail, stretches away across the landscape. Sometimes this tail is just a few dozen yards long. Sometimes it is a staggering half a mile, a dotted line of stone connecting the dead to the horizon. And these are not rare. There are thousands of them. What does this mean? Why invest this incredible effort, not just in the tomb itself, but in this long, seemingly decorative appendage? The answer tells us something deep about how they viewed the world. The pendant is a connector. The pendant is a connector. It's a physical manifestation of an unbroken line, stretching from the living present to the eternal past, from the ephemeral individual to the ancestral cosmic tapestry. What if I told you these weren't merely tombs, but monumental conduits, each stone a pulse in a planetary nervous system designed to maintain a dialogue across the veil of death? This staggering investment, these thousands of dotted lines across the desert, reveal a people who didn't just remember their dead. They actively integrated them into the very flow of existence, anchoring their identity, their future, to an unbroken chain of ancestry. It forces us to confront our own relationship with time, with memory, with the silent whispers of those who came before. What forgotten truths lie dormant in our own landscapes, waiting for us to decipher their monumental language? What do you believe these pendants truly represent? And how do you connect to your own deep past? Let me know in the comments below.